out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Hello and welcome to Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating. This is the World Cup themed Little Brother. I have to say it's magnificent, or something like that. I will get it right eventually. We are delving back in time once again into World Cups past, or in this particular case, World Cups missed in the years past. We're going all Scottish. We are singing Don't Come Home Too Soon, as they sang in 1998 as Scotland unceremoniously departed the last World Cup they have graced up until now. That is, they are back in 2026. But that has been 28 long years of pain and absence. And we have a couple of people along for the ride with me to delve into all this woe and torment that Scotland have had to suffer. Firstly, no Scottish team is ever right without a few Liverpool players. So Stephen Clarke is here. Hello there, Stephen.
Oh, looking forward. Not just looking forward to this. This is there's a touch of Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating reunited involved.
It is.
Well, massively looking forward to this. Yeah, I mean, for me, yeah, Scotland are going to be kind of like one of the big pulling points to actually kind of like draw me into the 2026 World Cup for all of the Infantino circus and World Peace Awards and all of the nonsense surrounding what's coming in the summer. Just see Scotland kick a ball in the World Cup finals again is going to be a glorious thing.
It will be. Well, will it be a glorious thing? Well, that's a good question to pose to our other guests. Will it be a glorious thing, or will it be a painful thing?
But even then, if it's a fallible thing, it will be a gloriously fallible thing.
Well, yes, if there's one thing Scotland over the years has taught us, it will be gloriously fallible at some point. It's just a question of when that point will fall. Also with us, so yes, Stephen mentioned it's a blast from the past, a reunion. Our good pal from days of yore, Lewis Ness, our Scottish representative on all things historical football that we like to bring on such occasions. But it's been a long time, mate, since we've spoken, and it is really good to get you back involved.
I'm absolutely delighted to, first of all, be making my debut, although it does feel like it's been way too long. And I'm glad that by the end of it, I will be talking about hopefully the happy ending of Scotland at a World Cup. It's just a shame we've got a whole 28 years to get through before that, which will always be fun and just coincides with the age that I am. I'm 28. I've never seen Scotland live at the World Cup. So I'm very much looking forward to the summer. Don't ask me how I feel after the summer, because one of these things, I'm always very optimistic, a la the Euros, which I'm sure we'll get a mention in 2020 and 2024, and they kind of end as most Scotland things do. But for now, I'm feeling very optimistic.
Exactly. It's a clean slate. You're all on 0 points. You just have to make sure you don't end up on 0 points. That is the trick. We'll see how that goes. We will get on to 2026 in due course. But yes, we are going back in time. So Lewis, you say you're 28. Were you born before or after that World Cup?
I was born just before it. So I hadn't even turned one yet. I was born late 97. So okay. I have no recollection of 98. So yeah, that would be very impressive. But no recollection at all. So it's one of those that retrospectively you go back, you have a look and you hear the stories and things like that. And everyone talks about how amazing it was being at a World Cup. And I've never been able to experience it. I mean, the closest thing was the Euros in 2020 or 2021 when it ended up being, because that was the first time I'd been conscious of an actual tournament in my lifetime. But there's something even more special about a World Cup, even if FIFA are trying their very best to make this World Cup not feel special at all. But that's not going to take away from the fact that Scotland are finally there for me.
Well, yeah, and of course it is harder to qualify for these days. It used to be the other way around way back. But now, of course, it's far easier to reach a Euros than it is a World Cup for a European team. So, and the manner of it, we're skipping ahead, but superb qualification this time around. Let's see how that goes. But yes, back in 1998, Scotland had the dubious honour of opening the tournament against Brazil. That didn't go well. A Tom Boyd own goal settling that one. They fought back well against Norway to get a point to keep them in it. And then Morocco, all you had to do was beat Morocco and you were set fair for the next round. But no, a 3-0 defeat and Jim Leighton flapping and throwing himself into the net to try and stop the ball going in. And that was the end of that. They were going home too soon, never to venture beyond their shores in World Cup terms until now. All right, Stephen, you remember 1998, even if Lewis doesn't. Scotland, this not a vintage team. This is under Craig Brown at this point. They'd been still regular qualifiers. They'd been at Euro 96. They'd qualified for the World Cup. They hadn't disgraced themselves, I guess, unlike in some of the others in the past. They'd done okay-ish, but it had fallen apart at the last. But to think that they wouldn't be there again, or that actually it was everything Scottish internationally related was about to fall off a cliff, would be, well, you just wouldn't have thought that.
You wouldn't have thought that. I mean, at the minute, I'm still trying to assimilate that Lewis looks on the 1998 World Cup in the same way I look on the 1974 finals. That's going to be a bit mind-blowing. I do remember watching the opening game of that World Cup, and was it like an afternoon kickoff? I have a feeling I took half a day off work.
It was a work event to go and watch it.
To watch that game. I can remember Scotland playing very, very well against Brazil in that game. Yeah, when you look at it, I think at the time you were thinking, this is a, compared to Scottish sides and squads of the past, you were looking at it and thinking this is no patch on kind of like those squads that you'd seen before in like 82 and you knew of in 78 and 74. But we'd watched them play in like 1986 as well. And I think that 1990 you start to think, it's starting to dilute a little bit. But then 98, you do think, this isn't a patch on kind of like squads of the past. Yet you look at it now and think, there's the Renaissance man Jim Leighton kind of like redeeming himself. That's a decent back line, surrounded, Colin Henry surrounded by decent players there. Paul Lambert, a Champions League winner. You've got a Gordon Jury in there. There are options and choices aplenty, in that Scotland side. In that Scotland squad, you've got John Collins, for instance, who I thought was a fantastic player. So lots of players with bags of experience, honours, north and south of the border. But yes, it was something of a bit of a kind of disappointment in a way that they played so well against Brazil in the opening game, yet regressed. And I think that was because you felt it was like a bit of a missed opportunity, to get the draw against Norway from behind, but then they were in this position to be able to get something tangible from the game by getting a positive result against Morocco. And it was quite it was quite numbing, really, to see them lose 3-0, basically. So you're so used to Scotland having these kind of hair's breadth kind of like flirtations with getting through to the knockout stages, or the next round of a World Cup. You'd seen it in '82 where was it Alex McLeish and Alan Hansen fell over each other against the Soviet Union. The game against Uruguay in '86 when Uruguay are down to 10 men from the first minute, and you think you just need one goal, Scotland, one goal. 1990, to come back from losing to Costa Rica to playing so well against Brazil, and we'll come to that in another follow-up module of this. Played so well against them.
It's almost like the fixtures were the wrong way round. Everything you're talking about there of the past. This should have been the defeat to Morocco should have started things off. They then battle back against Norway and then come so close against Brazil. That's how it should have been.
It does feel like 98 was a reversal of everything that we've become so used to with Scotland. Even like you look at 96, Euro 96, and kind of like, England putting 4 past the Netherlands, and Scotland need just one more goal. Whether that's kind of like an England goal at Wembley or Scotland scoring another one against Switzerland at Villa Park. All of those very, very close calls. Yet everything was set up for this game against Morocco, and it just felt like such a disappointment. And it was that in itself was a foreign thing to see Scotland just, kind of capitulate in that game against Morocco. But they were even walking away from that then, couldn't have imagined that it would be nearly 3 decades before Scotland would contest another World Cup, because in my childhood, Scotland not being at World Cup would be unthinkable because they were there at my first conscious World Cup in 82. Knew they'd been there in 78. They'd be there in 86, in 90. 94 passes me by, but, 98, there they are again. So, you just expect Scotland to be there. So for them not to be, I think it still took me another couple of World Cups before, I don't know, that feeling that Scotland not being at a World Cup was like the new normal in a way.
Yeah, they ended up at a new level. You mentioned the phrase missed opportunity. I think that those two words could sum up Scotland's entire World Cup history, really. But for Lewis, obviously, you don't recall this at all, but looking back on it, how do you feel? Two parts, I guess, really. Overall of Scotland's World Cup history, is it also utterly irrelevant to the younger generations, dare I say it, because it's all so far in the past? Or is it something to be clinging on to as a past beacon of hope to show, well, Scotland were once regulars at this level. They could once compete well. Why not again?
It's a bit of a tricky one because you've got the stories of sort of years gone by. And when you think of Scotland as a nation, obviously those close calls at the World Cup, Zaire, for example, and like times where you really should have done a little bit more. Whereas if we were in that position now, you would be very grateful as a Scotland fan. But if you think about sort of our greatest players, our greatest teams, when you're growing up, you obviously hear these names, and it's never anyone from obviously I mentioned I was born just prior to the 98 World Cup. There's not many players from that period to now, well, not till now, but up until about 2018 maybe, that you would say are, that's one of Scotland's greatest ever players. Whereas they are all sort of predate that sort of era in which I grew up watching Scotland, which is quite unfortunate. So it's one of those interesting things where you always hark back and hope it's gonna come back round. But the sort of state that Scottish football's been in over the past, in terms of like a league as well, in our perspective, and the domestic game has been in over the last 30 years, it sort of represents how it's gone internationally as well. And I just found it interesting, one thing that Steven said there when he said he found it very hard to think of a World Cup or a Euros without Scotland there, whereas I find it very hard to think of a World Cup or a Euros with Scotland there up until sort of 4 years ago or so, with obviously Steve Clarke taking over, which we'll get to. And with that, expectations obviously change because people are now criticising the way that we've performed at those tournaments. I'm not necessarily saying we should be happy just to be there, because I do think we have a very good squad at the moment. However, you've got to look at the progressive positive steps that we're putting in. It's somewhat similar, I suppose, to England in a way, when there was that terrible sort of barren period, sort of the Iceland era and other things like that with England. I've got to try and get some negativity in for a British Isles team that isn't just Scotland, which is hard because we're probably the one that's performed poorest in the past sort of 30 years. But they obviously had quite that resurgence building under Gareth Southgate. Obviously haven't necessarily won anything yet, but the feeling behind the squads and this group of players, there is a real belief now that, having brought in Thomas Tuchel, who obviously is one of the elite coaches in the game. Obviously, people have their own opinions on the fact a German manager is England manager. I don't have much of an opinion on it, really. But it's one of those things that you've now got a platform where there are people who will really believe that England should or could or should win this World Cup. And I don't think that's outlandish at all, given the progression. We have now had something similar under Steve Clarke, obviously not to win the World Cup, that's a bit too optimistic, but to actually go there and do something, whereas the period that we're about to talk about between 98 and pretty much 2018 is just a bit scattergun, bar a few sort of Alex McLeish and Walter Smith exceptions. So it's one of those that, other than sort of that 2008 period, it has almost felt like, will we ever do it again? But I'm glad that we have.
Well, yes, I'm sure there were many periods during this time where many a Scotland fan wondered, will we ever do it again? 2002 was their first opportunity. They'd actually been all right in the Euro 2000 qualifiers up to a point, reaching the playoffs where they had to face England. Oh dear. But this was Kevin Keegan's England, and they were a bit crap. But Scotland, well, they won at Wembley in the second leg, but they'd lost the first leg. So it was a close one. England went on to do terribly. So who knows how Scotland would have got on had they got there. But when it came to the 2002 qualifiers, Scotland, they finished third in their group, ultimately behind Croatia and Belgium. Now, it might be easy to think of these two as being perennial qualifiers and reaching the latter stages of tournaments. This wasn't Belgium, as they have become in the last 10 years or so. This was a far weaker entity, but still finishing well ahead of Scotland. Well, not well ahead. They finished ahead of Scotland, and it was the defeats against Bulgaria that ultimately cost them. Craig Brown resigned after that final qualifying match, so his era was over. A lengthy spell in charge, and it had 2 tournament appearances on his books. So, they'd done quite well. Overall, it had just tailed off. But now, well, you mentioned Scottish managers. Well, Scotland had their own. It was Bertie Vogts, the winner of Euro 96, no less. Bertie Vogts had some pedigree behind him, Stephen, didn't he? But shall we say this did not go well?
Yeah. I mean, I think looking at it now, for knowing what's gone on for Scotland since those times, it's kind of like, you kind of think actually that's a missed opportunity there for Scotland in 2002. There's a game where they blow a 2-0 lead at Hampden against Belgium, summer 2001, I think it was, which is the one. You always look for that kind of like fork in the road, where it could have gone one way or the other, and that's kind of the game that shifts it into Belgium's favour. Yeah, the whole, McBurtie was era. The whole ethos of it was just kind of like a bit strange because there's a European Championship winning manager. He's done everything in the game as a player, as a coach, as a backup, assistant to Franz Beckenbauer in the 1990 World Cup. He was, took the job on and immediately took Germany to the final of Euro 92, would go and win Euro 96 with, I think, a German team that was, it lacks satisfaction, not quite German enough. I remember that tournament and people saying it was the worst Germany side that there'd been, yet they were certainly still good enough to kind of like knock England out in the semi-finals and go on and break Czechia hearts, as we need to call them now. So, yeah, looking back, it is a missed opportunity, but I think there's still, at that point in time, an awkwardness to the concept of someone who's not from that nation coaching them. It had happened all over the world and it wasn't a problem, but people were still struggling to get their heads around the concept of a German managing Scotland, of a Swede managing England. It became less so as even though it took over a decade, because people still struggled with the concept of Capello being the England manager. So yeah, it was quite the departure for Scotland to do. Actually, and within that, it was Andy Roxburgh at Euro 92 who took Scotland there, but with Craig Brown involved. So yeah, it was a kind of awkward era for Scotland, but it wasn't an era in which, looking back at least, you're thinking they weren't in the irredeemable position or seemingly irredeemable position that they would go on to find themselves in, a decade or later.
Well, yes, they did. And it's interesting on the foreign manager thing, because England, I guess, have in recent, probably this century, have had a scarcity of quality coaches, opportunities. We can argue whether opportunity comes their way or whether their English coaches are overlooked in the Premier League because of the high stakes involved. Whereas for Scottish managers, traditionally super strong, there's regularly been many Scottish managers at the top end of the English game, as well as in Scotland, of course. So maybe it was not a great thing that Bertie Vogts came in when he's not Tuchel caliber, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I'd say right, almost the right man in the wrong era. If Scotland were appointing a man who'd been part of a World Cup winning coaching staff, who'd won a European Championship, if that was the type of appointment that Scotland were going to make when it comes to kind of like replacing Steve Clarke when he decides to stand down, then wow, we'd all be blown away. And at the time, it was that outlandishness, and within that, I think when things aren't going right, that's when it bites all the more. So this is where it kind of like Scotland kind of consumed themselves a little bit in the Bertie Vogts era, because you look at those 2002 qualifiers, Scotland start incredibly well. All right against some of the weaker opposition. They win 2 and draw 1 of the first 3, all of them on the road, and they get a draw away to Croatia as part of that. And this is where, when they've done that for the first 3 games and then they're playing Belgium at Hampden and they're 2-0 up, just how strong of a position Scotland have got themselves into 3.5 games into qualifying, and then it starts to unravel. So, it is that type of thing where if someone's in a position of authority, everything's great when it's all bubbling along nicely. But when it goes wrong, it does kind of eat itself.
Well, yes, it did not go well. I mean, it was a bit hampered with a few players I think had retired at the end of Craig Brown's time, so he was building a new squad. But it was a bit of a struggle in Euro 2004 qualifying. Okay, they reached the playoffs again, done okay, but they were thumped in the second leg, 6-0 against the Dutch, despite having done well in the home leg, of course. But I guess this is now coming to a head when we go into the 2006 World Cup qualifying. Ultimately, this would be a campaign that saw Scotland drop all the way down to 77th in the FIFA World Rankings. Now, you may not put a huge amount of store by the rankings overall, but that does paint a picture. I think it's fair to say, Lewis, isn't it? And Vokes quit quite early on during this campaign, blaming the hostile media for his departure. Well, the hostile media probably had something to do with how the performances were going. And we had Walter Smith coming in and magically things improved. So we've got a well-renowned, experienced Scottish coach taken over from the World Cup storied Bertie Vokes, and things did improve a bit. Lewis, didn't they? I mean, maybe it felt a little more right having somebody of the caliber of Walter Smith there.
Well, it's one of those ones. I don't think anyone's going to debate which of the two is the higher quality of manager. But I think there's quite a few things to kind of consider. I don't think that Vokes was entirely at fault, which is something that's quite controversial to say here in Scotland. I don't think he was a correct appointment, as we've talked about. And I do think he was also hampered by, as I mentioned earlier on, the state that Scottish football was in at the moment in terms of the actual quality of player that we had. It was certainly a lot less than it had been. We were a long way from vintage Scottish players, your Dalglish, your Dennis Law, all those other players. And even to a sort of a lesser extent, you had the likes of, just after 2002 qualifying, Colin Hendry, Kevin Gallagher, Tom Boyd. They never played for Scotland again. Even the likes of Billy Dodds, who actually did quite well in that sort of 2002 qualifying, who I'm going to give a special mention to as an Inverness fan, former Inverness manager. So I have to get that one in. Might as well mention Neil McCann as well. He scored in that qualifying, also an Inverness manager. So I had to get them in here somewhere because there's not that much of a link between Inverness and Scotland. But where that kind of left you was Vokes had a big transition period to go through, and I was doing a bit of research and some quite interesting statistics. While he left the job, I think it was 1.5 years early, he managed to give 60 players caps in that time, of which there were 40 international debuts. So if that doesn't tell you that Vokes didn't really know who to play, what to play, there is an abundance of players who only got a single cap from his time. And if you look down the list, I would argue not many were a success, other than 2 big exceptions in James McFadden and Darren Fletcher. But if you throw enough mud at the wall, eventually it'll stick. But nonetheless, where that kind of left you was Walter Smith coming in, one of the all-time great Scottish managers, even before he'd gone back to Rangers and did all that he did in his second stint. He was already considered one of the greatest Scottish managers of all time. And what I was mentioning there about that sort of core of players that Vokes basically decided to bring in, anyone who had half a decent stint got a Scotland cap. There was so many friendlies in his period of time, and there was a lot of kind of confusion, I think. And Walter Smith, one of the earliest things he said, and I've got the quote just because it kind of paints the picture, I think. He said, "I think the number of friendlies in the past has resulted in too many withdrawals from the Scotland squad. You have to question the benefit of playing them unless you're certain you have a group of players who are going to be playing in the next competitive game. Recent history suggests that hasn't been the case. It's been more advantageous if we have group meetings where we can lay down the future of the international team. The first thing I have to do is get a nucleus of players together, so I don't envision the situation where we cap as many players as we did in the past." That tells you a big sort of philosophy shift between the two, which did come into fruition for the remainder of that qualifying campaign for 2006, where Walter Smith does a better job in there than Vokes certainly did. It's a pretty tough start to life when his first game is at the San Siro against Italy, which are a team that have caused us quite a bit of heartbreak over the years, especially the Euros after qualification. We don't need to talk about that though. But you watch the game, Scotland are very competent, aside from 2 Andrea Pirlo goals, 2 amazing free kicks. There's actually a compilation on YouTube just following him throughout the game. He's absolutely brilliant, as you expect from Pirlo. But we looked a lot more well set up than we kind of had under Vokes. And you're going to lose to moments of quality like that against a side that has Buffon, Cannavaro, Chiellini, Totti, Gattuso. You could see the positives kind of through the remainder of what Walter Smith would do in that initial qualifying campaign, a good result against Moldova, and you had a good draw against Italy again at Hampden, late equaliser by Grosso, and of course the win at Norway, I think, wrapped up the group, but you could still see it wasn't a Scotland of those times gone by, and perhaps the Scotland teams that Walter Smith had been part of this coaching staff for previously, because we get a pretty bad draw against Belarus and then end up losing at home to Belarus, which is very Scottish. So it's not a vintage team at that era, but having Walter Smith as well as kind of your likes of Darren Fletcher, James McFadden that I mentioned, Craig Gordon, these people who are, you wouldn't put them in all-time great Scotland 11s, perhaps Fletcher and McFadden aside, but they're certainly very good players. They would have had decent stints in the Premier League in terms of McFadden. Fletcher, a mainstay, one of the greatest all-time Premier League teams. So it looked like there could have been a turn in direction, and what comes next really solidifies that. But as we kind of know, that wasn't what ended up happening. But there was a bit more optimism by the time that Smith had finished that initial World Cup qualifying campaign, I think it's fair to say.
It did improve a little bit, and ultimately, as you say, Scotland would finish third in the group behind Italy, who qualified, and Norway, who didn't. That then took Scotland into Euro 2008 qualifying, initially under Walter Smith, but then that carried on under Alex McLeish. Victories home and away against France in this campaign. Now, this is probably the peak of the lean years, isn't it? Not qualification, but actually coming damn close when in a group. I know we're veering off into the Euros here, but it's worth a mention. I think it's fairly safe to say. In a group with the 2 World Cup finalists from 2006, no less, France and Italy. I mean, you can't get more unfortunate with a draw. And yet, beating France home and away, superb goal, sealing the victory in Paris as well. A real high point of the era. I think in terms of the Smith time in charge, I think everything you've mentioned there, all absolutely correct. I think also, as well as the smaller squad limit, it helped create a bit more of a club atmosphere or team atmosphere, or maybe it's just, you got a closer knit group because it was a smaller number and it wasn't constantly changing. And I think that really did massively help. But ultimately, Scotland, despite those victories over France, would miss out on Euro 2008. Thanks to a loss in Georgia, probably more primarily than anything else, which is a very Scottish way, as you say. This is the way things go. But let's move swiftly on from the Euros, because we're not here to discuss them. We're here for the World Cup. And in 2010, we now had George Burley in charge, Stephen. So we're moving rapidly through the many storied Scottish managers of the time. George Burley, the new manager, criticised from the off in the Scottish press because this team lost their first 2010 World Cup qualification match against Macedonia. Oh dear, here we go again. It's the same old story, isn't it? You come off these positives of these wins over France, narrowly failing. It went down to a final day qualifier for 2008 at home to Italy. It could have been, as Lewis talked about there, it went the other way. But here we are, straight into the next campaign, and here we go again.
At this point, it's kind of like the theory and the practicalities just butting heads with one another, because you look at coaches like Alex McLeish, like Walter Smith, like Craig Burley, who've done fine things in both playing and managerial capacities. What George Burley did with Ipswich for taking them into the Premier League in 2000 was a remarkable thing. He put together a really good team that played some fantastic football and winning promotion, and then played some fantastic football in their first season back in the top flight when they were knocking on the door of the Champions League, and did qualify for UEFA Cup. They really put themselves in and amongst it. And then, he had a decent, it would have been before his Scotland time, wouldn't it? When he was at Hearts for half a season or something like that. And he did look like he was going to do something remarkable with them for a few months, and then it all kind of like imploded. So again, his player gone to the World Cup in '82. There's everything you're looking at there is thinking maybe he's the man that can piece this back together. I was just looking there, the seeding for the qualifiers I found interesting. And bear in mind from 98 when they're still part of the rank and file, part of the furniture of World Cups. For the 2002 qualifiers, they were casting Pot B, alongside Portugal, Italy, England, Russia. So seen, for the 2002 qualifiers as a serious contender, and then by 2006 they're down in Pot C, and they do bob back up to Pot B for the 2010 qualifiers, which kind of denotes that, yes, they're pointing in the right direction again, but it really is just like, where is that glass ceiling now? And that's where we find this. But obviously, when a nation goes into regression, suddenly the calibre of the teams, the amount of good teams that they have to face increases. You go from having one giant in your group to having a giant and a would-be giant, and suddenly it becomes massively difficult to qualify for World Cups. But again, I think at this point in time, I'm looking at the calibre of coaches and thinking you could do something, but they're kind of let down by the fact that it becomes the well of players becomes a little bit drier than we're used to. And I think this is where I'm going back to what we're saying about that 98 squad, that at the time you're looking at it and thinking this is a patch on previous Scotland squads. Looking back retrospectively, actually, there's some very, very, very good players in that 1998 squad. But through the noughties, you're looking at that and thinking, there's no John Collins. Now this seriously isn't, this is a Scotland collective of players that is nowhere near the calibre of the 98, cohort.
No, absolutely. And I guess, Lewis, that the regression Stephen talked about there, tougher groups, well, yep, absolutely. That's just what happens, isn't it? But I guess the optimism of the Euro 2008 qualifiers, it rapidly disappeared, didn't it? So in the 2010, they lost that opener against Macedonia. They lost 3-0 to the Dutch. There was disciplinary problems. Barry Ferguson and Alan McGregor, that's the captain and goalkeeper, excluded in the next game against Iceland thanks to disciplinary issues. They then lost 4-0 in Norway, or against Norway, and had to then win their final two to have a hope of the playoffs. They ended up losing the final game to the Dutch, and that was the end of that. And as was Burley gone soon after with a 3-0 friendly loss to Wales soon after. So yeah, that optimism, Lewis, it didn't last long. Sunk back or regressed back to where they'd been a couple of years before, I suppose. It was that brief blip of hope. I don't know, does that make it worse that the World Cup campaigns were stuttering so badly when you could see the ability that was briefly there?
It's really frustrating. I mean, for me personally, and again, this is an age thing, I was growing up and obviously really getting into Scotland and watching them just before the Euro 2008 qualifiers, in terms of when you always watch football growing up, but when you're starting to pay a bit more attention, and I'm seeing Scotland beat France twice, and I'm seeing James McFadden score one of the great Scotland goals. Fortunately, we scored about 3 more a few months ago that probably top that now. But you're growing up and you're seeing these things happen and you're thinking, we're going to be at the Euros or the World Cup soon. That's not an issue. And then you have what is the start of this sort of period from the 2010 World Cup qualifying until probably just before Steve Clarke comes in, maybe a little bit earlier, is, I would say, the worst period to be a Scotland fan. And this is sort of right in my teenage, young adult life. And it's just very depressing to be a Scotland fan. And it's one of those that, to kind of put it into a moment, if you want to encapsulate it, you mentioned the World Cup 2010 qualifying, one of the games in which we draw 0-0 to Norway, and the Chris Iwelumo famous miss from about 3 yards out. That is kind of all you need to know about Scotland in that era. Immediately afterwards, you mentioned the Barry Ferguson and Alan McGregor incident and what they're doing on the bench, which we're not a video podcast. I wouldn't be showing you anyway, but everyone knows what they were doing on the bench at the time. So it very much kind of encapsulates what Scotland was at that era very much. It felt like one of those, you're in the darkness and you may never come back out from it. And Burley, sacked after winning only 3 games out of 14 and just didn't ever really work out, which, as Stephen says, it's a bit of a weird one given the kind of pedigree of Scottish coaches in particular. And while I don't think this is a vintage Scotland pool of players, certainly not bad enough to be getting humiliated in some of the games you were. And Georgia, the familiar kind of foes, sort of creeping up again and things like that. So it's a weird one. I mean, you look at this sort of in Macedonia and things like that. We've always had an issue, I think, of putting the ball in the back of the net, which which kind of comes to fruition very shortly afterwards. Obviously, we're not talking about the Euros too much, but Craig Levine's 4-6-0, I have to give that a quick little mention. That's just around the corner. So between Chris Iwelumo's miss from 3 yards and the 4-6-0, I think that sums up everything it was to be a Scotland fan in this period.
Well, yes, Craig Levine, he was the next man up after Burley was sacked following that disappointing campaign. And yes, bizarre team lineups and formations, a lack of will to attack, I guess, at times is very, very strange. Stephen, and Craig Levein, he survived to take us into the next World Cup, the 2014 qualifiers, but didn't last too long in that one. Another tale of failing from the off, really. 2 points from the first 4 games saw the end of him. And as much as Scotland then improved under the next man-up, who we'll get onto in a sec, it's just, well, you failed before you've even begun. And that's the big nightmare. I mean, with hindsight, should Levine have gone and the one who came after him, Gordon Strachan, come in sooner? Because he seemed to bring a lot more positivity to things.
Again, you look at a Craig Levein and think, you've so much experience, so much that you could pass on to the generation of players that you are coaching. Here's a player that went to the 1990 World Cup. He was, in the side that played against Sweden. He was, Andy Roxburgh was going to build his defence for the game against Brazil around Craig Levein. He was a good defender. This is kind of like the thing about Scotland at this point in time. Yes, they don't have the Dalglishes and the Souness's of old, but you don't always need the world-class players. What you need is, you can get by with a collection of very good professionals, and they can drag a team a long, long way. Yeah, it's always perplexing to see a personality, a football person, be a decent player, but then you see him try to do the manager's role, and he might get it right somewhere, but then get it so badly wrong somewhere else. The thing about the 2014 World Cup qualifiers for Scotland is that they only win once at home, which is massively telling. You look at that and think, turn a couple of those the other way. You're looking at there's 2 defeats. They're losing to a Wales that are kind of, I don't know, they're still licking their wounds over not qualifying for Euro 2008 in quite heartbreaking circumstances, and they're working their way back to being what they would become just a short few years later. But I think there's still a fragility there, and the fact that this Scotland finish ahead of Wales, a Wales team that will reach the semi-finals of Euro 2016, is just kind of like a weird kind of juxtaposition within that. But I think that the perennial issue with Scotland, and even in the good days, is kind of like scoring goals. You always get that vibe that they just don't score enough, and to score the goals when it matters. So when you've got a Scotland that's being built for purpose, and this is not a disgraceful World Cup qualifying campaign by any means. You look at kind of like, was it 2010? 2010 or 2000, there's one where they only score 6 goals across 8 games. I think this one they scored 8. So it's like there's a goal a game average there. And you're not going to qualify for the World Cup with that. But at this point in time, Scotland managers are just dealing with what they've got, the best that they can come up with, that's available to them. This is still a Scotland that's a little bit further away from an Andy Robertson, Scott McTominay, Tierney era. Those players that will make that difference. 2014, we're still 12 years away from a World Cup for Scotland. But again, it's these, you know, kind of reticent to call them peaks and troughs, but it's almost like there's troughs and plateaus in a way. Mentioned the word glass ceiling earlier on, and that's what it felt like to me, is that you need that kind of, because even in like the Ali McCoy stage, you think there's got to be goals there, for a collective Scotland side, and it never quite was. So when you lose players of that calibre, we're looking at World Cups that I watched as a kid where Scotland went with the Dalglishes and the Archibalds, the Charlie Nicholases, the Mo Johnsons, McCoy's Jury, Robert Fleck, who seemed to be able to turn it on at times.
Joe Jordan, a World Cup stalwart for scoring regularly.
3 World Cups. There was plenty of players, plenty of choices. Scotland. Ali McLeod, elected not to take Andy Gray to the 1978 World Cup. And things like that. It's just wild. But then this, Scotland are just kind of like they go from having some good strikers and still not being a high scoring team to being a team that can't score goals, and they've not got that kind of that striker anymore that you think is a guarantee of goals.
Well, quite, but things did improve a little bit under Strachan. Well, not initially. He did lose his first couple of games, and that actually earned Scotland the dubious honour of being the first UEFA team to be mathematically eliminated from the 2014 World Cup. Now, in a time where we have San Marino, Andorra, Liechtenstein, and the likes, that's an accolade of sorts. They did round things off, though, beating Croatia twice in qualifying, which is impressive. Croatia, who would go on and qualify themselves, and Scotland sort of clawed their way away from the bottom places in the group. But a troubling campaign overall. And then before we come to the next World Cup, Lewis, you mentioned Euro 2016 earlier. Now, of course, England embarrassed themselves at that tournament, but that was in a knockout match, which is obviously something Scotland haven't reached. But that particular tournament must really stick in the craw for Scottish fans, because every other home nation and the Republic of Ireland not only made it to that tournament, but all reached the knockout stages. And Scotland were looking on from home, having struggled again and fallen short in a 6-team group where 2 go through automatically and a third to a playoff. Scotland managed to finish 4th and miss out entirely. I don't know. It's just got to be a bit of an agonising point in amongst it all, purely not through Scotland and what they did necessarily, but the fact that everybody around them is there and enjoying, to one degree or another, the party in France.
It was a really difficult era to be a Scotland fan. It was definitely my least favourite of my sort of obviously time supporting them. It was, as you say, you're seeing all these teams have real progression, and while Wales were the one that really hurt, because while we obviously didn't have a Gareth Bale, and I would love to have a Gareth Bale in any era of a Scotland team, I mean, who wouldn't? But even just how solid they were, irrespective of him and Ramsey, they were just so well put together. Scalps against, well, all the big teams that they played, they were absolutely brilliant. Even the Northern Ireland, and you just saw how solid they were at the time. And we just weren't that at that period of time. And I think the really difficult thing was, not only were we not particularly solid at the back or anything, we had, as Stephen alluded to, the amount of goals we were scoring in qualifying was just pretty poor. We never really looked like doing very much. And it did kind of feel like, are we ever kind of going to get over the line? I mean, in terms of Scotland strikers, it's always been, as you mentioned, a bit of an issue that from certainly the period that we last qualified to the World Cup to now, we have never really had that out-and-out goal scorer in that period of time, unlike a Gareth Bale or a Harry Kane. And I know these players don't just emerge, they are generational talents. But we, even to this day, as brilliant as Scotland are for our current iteration, we're still not scoring a lot of goals. We don't have these sort of volume goal scorers. The closest thing is probably Lawrence Shankland, but generally Clarke will go for a Dykes or a Adams just for what they offer. So it has always been an issue. It was a huge problem at this period of the time. There was a rotation of strikers who just weren't ever really able to kind of implement what they're about too much. And Stephen put it well, we were still a little while off your Robbos and Tierneys and even your sort of John McGinns, who would come in a few years later. It was sort of the 2018 World Cup qualifying. That's when you started to see these quality players who previously there'd obviously been such a big affiliation with Scottish players in the English game who would come to the national team, and some of the names that we've mentioned. Around about 2018 is when that started to creep back in, and that's when there started to feel like a bit more sort of positivity. But in, as you say, 2016 Euros qualification, that was again a very dark time to be a Scotland fan, of which there have been quite a few.
Another dark time, yes. Oh, well, you bring us into the 2018 qualifiers. And again, this is a tale of screwing it up from the start again and then improving. But as you talk there, things started to improve from the time period of 2018 onwards, more or less, or late 2017. So that improvement happened through this campaign, but actually continued on for once. But again, well, this is one with England having embarrassed themselves at Euro 2016, while Scotland now had the chance to inflict a little more misery because they were drawn in the same qualifying group for World Cup 2018. First competitive fixture between the two since 1999. But before Scotland got to that, they kind of screwed up the group for themselves a little bit already. A draw at home to Lithuania early on, in fact, only rescued in the 89th minute from a thoroughly embarrassing home defeat. That was followed by a defeat in Slovakia. And then that itself was followed by the 3-0 loss at Wembley. So, yeah, all very same old at this point of not going well. But by the return fixture, though, this is one Scotland really should have won, Lewis. No, I mean, Lee Griffiths, not someone who you'd imagine would have terrified the watching English as he lined up a free kick late in the game, but he did the trick twice in the closing minutes of this game to turn a 1-0 deficit into a 2-1 lead as we entered stoppage time before Harry Kane did what Harry Kane does. But goodness me, that must have been a moment, a game to, as much as it didn't end how Scottish fans hoped for, it was surely a moment to really rekindle the belief.
Well, it's one of those that supporting Scotland in this time was about moments. It was about enjoying the moments that came rather than expecting any real success. And that was one of the big moments. You mentioned there 2 free kicks from Griffiths, who will not speak too much about because he's had an interesting career beyond that game. But 2 of the greatest goals I've seen as a Scotland fan, and kind of putting that in amongst the McFadden goal at France, the France qualifying. And it's one of those that you think, you know what, it's been difficult being a Scotland fan for all these years, but beating England at Hampden, that's one of those things that no matter what's happening, a win against your rivals in qualifying, even though realistically England are going to be the ones that go to the World Cup, it's one of those that you can always take some joy in. But we did what Scotland do, and rather than play the ball away in the final moments of added time, Stuart Armstrong, who is a brilliant player, he's done so much for Scotland, and I've got such an affiliation for him, decides to try play the ball up from the back instead of just punting it clear, for lack of a better way of putting it. And it's intercepted by Kyle Walker, which leads to the inevitable, give Harry Kane a chance. He's going to score it. And 2-2 in the end. A very, very late goal. Pretty heartbreaking. I mean, you are realistically going to take a draw against this England team, but it was right there. It was so close. So it was a bit of a heartbreak in that one, yeah. But looking back, it's one of those, it's the moments where things were still rough around the edges. There was a lot still to do, but you could see there was some positive momentum, and we were a little distance away now from 4-6-0 and Chris Iwelumo and Bertie Vogts and all those other things as well. So you weren't quite turning the tide yet, but there was some positives to be taking at long last.
Well, you've still got Lyndon Dykes hanging around these days, so we haven't fully left those days behind, have we? But anyway, we've all got tales of teams who should have kicked the ball out instead of faffing on and throwing things away at the last gasp, Stephen, haven't we? I'm sure you could recall things back in the day where if only John Barnes had hoofed it in the stands, you'd have been fine. How do we reflect on Gordon Strachan's time, though? He left his position at the end of the 2018 campaign by mutual consent. And I guess we know what comes next because Steve Clarke was appointed the following year in 2019. to be Scotland manager. And obviously now we can, with the benefit of hindsight, know how incredibly well that has gone for Scotland, how this improvement has progressed. But I think for Gordon Strachan, all the things Lewis talked about there, of the 4-6-0 of Craig Levein, how dour it was, how utterly miserable an experience it must have been following Scotland in those years. Not simply through the failures to qualify, we were getting used to that, surely, but the manner of them, the style, the seemingly hoisting the white flag before you'd even begun at times. Whereas Strachan brought a lot more vibes back to it all. I guess he's a fairly energetic, charismatic person, which Levein really doesn't seem to be at all. And I think that certainly helped, and I guess laid the foundations for what Steve Clarke's done. Would that be fair?
I think so. I think at the minute he's probably not looked at in those terms, but I think as we know, once you start to put a bit of time between, his spell in charge, or anything to do with football, really, it does take 10, 15, maybe 20 years before people look back and think, you know what, actually that's where you can read it from and say what a difference that was made there. And Strachan made a massive difference, because you have to look at this qualifying campaign and they're unbeaten at home, and the scoring more goes, all right, there's 5 against Malta and stuff like that, but this is a team that's starting to grow. This is a team that's starting to enjoy playing football, I think, once again, and that's always a big thing, in the rehabilitation of a football team or a nation, national team. Not to fear the ball, not to fear playing. And clearly under Craig Levein, you've got this kind of just curling up into the fetal position and taking a kicking. The Levein Scotland is very much kind of like in a bit of a rough end of town, trying not to take a kicking. Whereas kind of like Gordon Strachan's kind of like, come on lads, let's go to kind of like Let's go and see if we can get into this bar here, and actually managing to get into 1 or 2 bars that even he's probably quite surprised to be able to get into. But yeah, it is that kind of green shoots of recovery is very much in this. And I think in years to come, people will look back on Strachan's spell in charge of Scotland as being, so many of the foundations being laid for what Steve Clarke's managed to go on and do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us then into the Steve Clarke era, Lewis. Now, this is where fortunes have followed the upward path, shall we say. His first tournament, he made it all the way to the finals. And your first tournament as a fan, Euro 2020 brackets 1. Scotland, well, qualifying didn't actually go that brilliantly, I guess. It probably should be noted. They finished some distance behind Belgium and Russia in the qualifying group, but did make it to the playoffs thanks to their Nations League performances. I think on this occasion, playoffs though, Lewis, this must have been a superb occasion for you. There was Israel in the first playoff round and a win on penalties. Then Serbia away in the final and another win on penalties. And oh my God, you qualified for a tournament, Lewis. Again, we're on the Euros. We've veered off slightly, but how did it feel, Lewis, to finally see your team qualify for a tournament, especially in the manner they did it, which was, let's face it, rather dramatic? Before we burst your bubble with how it went, how did you feel at this point to have finally broken through?
It was absolutely incredible. It's one of those that before we get on to that, I'm going to give a special mention as well to McLeish, who kind of temporarily came back, but it kind of felt like a stopgap appointment. It wasn't massively successful, but he was very influential in the kind of Nations League success, which obviously Clarke built on. And the one other thing that he did as well was convince McTominay to play for Scotland, which that's gone all right, isn't it? But obviously Clarke was the one that put the hard yards in and actually got us there. And it was one of those where it sort of felt like it wouldn't get too much better as a Scotland fan. It's quite incredible to me that we've kicked on from there. I don't want to not talking about the tournaments in themselves. That is the next step, is to improve at the actual tournaments. But we're getting there. We had a brilliant Euro 2024 qualifying. I'll give that a quick mention as well. And we're really good in World Cup qualifying. Not so much in terms of how we played, but certainly the results. It's one of those that we have built such a platform now that we're not thinking, oh wow, Scotland are at a tournament. We're actually thinking, no, we should be doing well in qualifying. Not expecting us to beat every team we play, although we can beat Spain, so who knows. But it's one of those where it was the most incredible feeling ever, really, at that time to see Scotland at the tournament. It was like nothing else. The closest thing to, I can actually get a second Inverness mention in here, is the fact that Inverness winning the Scottish Cup in 2015, something I never thought would happen. And that final game, the one to take us there in 2020, the first goal before penalties was Ryan Christie scored it. And I don't think anyone can sum up better how that moment felt than that iconic interview with Ryan Christie just after Scotland have gone through to the Euros. Again, an Inverness lad and one of our best players, I think, who is just in absolute tears. Can't believe the fact we're actually there. He's a similar age to myself, so he's grown up with this as well. It was really quite unbelievable, and the work that Steve Clarke has done has been just really, really impressive. There has been, as we'll get on to, criticisms of some of the football at times and all of these other things, but it felt like a bit more of an optimistic signing, ironically, given Clarke's demeanour and the football that we play at times, just kind of off the fact that rather than some of the recent signings that we'd brought in, your sort of Craig Levein and some of the other people, McLeish, when he came back at the second stint, Clarke was coming off a really good trajectory. He had just taken Kilmarnock to their best ever season, third in the Premiership, and humbling Celtic and Rangers at times throughout that season, as well as he was manager of the year twice in a row here in Scotland, got Kelly European football, having finished fifth this season before as well. So he was coming off a really, really good stint here in the domestic game. So you had that, as I say, ironic optimism with Clarke's demeanour at times, but you did feel it, and it was really, really feeling quite prominent going into that Euro 2020 campaign, which if we want to skip how that one went, that's fine by me.
Well, firstly, you're absolutely right on Steve Clarke and his demeanour. A happy Steve Clarke is the same as a miserable Steve Clarke. I don't think there's any way to tell the difference. But on the way they qualified, you mentioned Ryan Christie's goal. Well, Serbia equalised in the last minute, which is what ultimately took it to extra time and penalties. So I guess having felt like it all got thrown away to then still come through just enhances the experience. Sadly, no fans, of course, at any of these final qualifiers, given the times that we lived in then, which seems odd to even think of now. We will not go into the tournament. Suffice to say that I feel slightly guilty that I may have jinxed it all for you, Lewis, because I think I recall sending you a message before Scotland's first game against Czechia. As Stephen says, you're correct. We should term them now. And I'm sure I sent you a message saying, oh, enjoy it, your first tournament game, Lewis. And then, of course, Patrick Schick scores from halfway.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah.
All these lovely messages that you guys all sent me before the game, and then what kind of happened afterwards. But it was that feeling before the actual game, before kickoff, and before everything that went on. It was I had never felt a feeling like that before as a Scotland fan. It was just it was nice to understand what everyone else sort of enjoys as a fan of a team that doesn't take 28 years to qualify for tournaments.
Well, let's just say you lived the full experience. You had all that hope and expectation and delight at getting there, and then it all went horribly wrong. That is the quintessential Scottish experience of tournaments. That's how it always used to be. Forget all these years of nothingness. That's how it used to be. Okay, so 2022 World Cup then, last time around. Steve Clarke, of course, is in charge, and they finished second in the qualifying group and ended up in the playoffs, and it was Ukraine. It was a semi-final this time. I think it would have been Wales in the final had you got past Ukraine. Ultimately, that saw Wales qualify and end up in England's group, as it happened as well. I don't know. Recalling that time, it felt to me that Ukraine had a sense of destiny about them. That the fact that they'd gone to Scotland and won, they were a neutral choice, obviously, given what was going on with them. A team without a home, really, at this point, and they won through, but couldn't do it against Wales. But for Scotland, I think, again, you alluded to it, Lewis, with the Euro 2016 feats of Wales. where overall the Welsh squad, barring one superstar individual, that's probably doing them a disservice. Reece, our colleague, wouldn't thank me for that. They did have more than just Bale, absolutely, but they didn't have the depth. And Scotland, well, obviously far more often over the years, have had a stronger squad than Wales. You could only imagine what an incredible qualifier that would have been. There's been some incredible World Cup qualifiers decided between Wales and Scotland at the last, and they'd all gone Scotland's way. So frustrating. I mean, Stephen, it's a fixture, had it happened, that would have been echoes of so many games past, and it would have been hyped up to the hilt, wouldn't it? And we didn't get it. We got the Ukrainian story instead, and then that didn't quite go to plan for the neutral, I suppose, either.
Yeah. I mean, I was all geared up for that being Scotland Wales. Shades of Anfield 77 and Ninian Park 85 and all of that, because it spoke to the inner child. And of course, you wanted Ukraine to do. I think we were all stuck in a little bit of certainly the 80s kids, between a rock and a hard place. Of course, you wanted Ukraine to prosper and do well and to get there, but you wanted Scotland to get there. You also wanted to add this kind of this face off between Wales and Scotland for a place in the World Cup. Just would have been the most magnificent thing. So yeah, that felt. I thought it was weird because it felt you had to feel kind of such a good thing for Ukraine, but at the same time, you were lamenting what was missed.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lewis, it was still a largely positive campaign. Scotland finished second in their group, narrowly behind Denmark. More of them.
And within that, when it came to the playoffs, Scotland were the second seeded team, and this just shows how well they were doing, how they're progressing. From qualifying for a European Championship to being serious contention of qualifying for a World Cup, and I think to go from being second seed to losing that semi-final, that's a blow. And within that, you look at what Scotland have done since then. It's a fantastic response.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lewis, it does speak of the upward trajectory again. They'd come relatively close to qualifying for a World Cup. It was at least within reach now, which hadn't been the case, as we've talked about through many of these other campaigns. It is something that's not only within reach, but a realistic ambition, I suppose.
It definitely was. You mentioned it earlier on when you were talking about the playoff semi-final. It was one of the weirdest games I've ever watched, because it was one of the only times, I think, obviously as a Scottish person, I may be getting this wrong, but generally I think we're a neutral's favourite. We're one of those teams that everyone's kind of rooting for Scotland, maybe England less so at times, but generally like at the Euros that would come after in 2024, which I really don't want to speak about that group because that was interesting. We were quite the beloved team and things like that. But that night, it did not feel like it at all. Obviously, Ukraine and the horrors that had been going on there. And it was one of those that you didn't feel like it was a chance. Well, you did feel like it was a chance gone. Of course it is. You're that close to a World Cup and you don't make it. But we'd been pretty good in the qualifying. We weren't better than Denmark, but that was a great Denmark side. So you can't really begrudge that too much. But you look at previous years and previous iterations of Scotland, those Israel and Austria games would have tripped us up a lot more than they certainly did in that campaign. And while it's always disappointing to not go through, it felt more like, okay, we go again. We've got the Euros qualifiers, and that group of players that was coming through at that sort of era, we mentioned them, like Andy Robertson, Kieran Tierney, they were kind of in their prime really at that time. Tierney, when he wasn't, obviously had his injury struggles. John McGinn was absolutely incredible in that period. Scott McTominay, Ryan Christie, all these players that I've mentioned, you knew we've still got a good amount of time with them left. Like we'll go again. It doesn't necessarily mean we'll qualify, but it wasn't like the sort of 2010s era where you felt like, where is this coming from? You could see there's a good core of players there to build upon, and Clarke staying for longer, which some people actually weren't very happy with at the time. He's someone who's actually come under quite a lot of criticism throughout his stint, which I by no means think that he's perfect as Scotland manager. He's definitely done some things wrong. However, I find it quite difficult to criticise him given all the incredible things and memories he's given me so far. I do hope we can do a bit different in the groups, but there was an optimism there as a Scotland fan, which I've never had before. So I was disappointed to lose out to Ukraine, but I didn't think that's it. We're never going to do it. I thought we go again for 2026 and the 2024 Euros. And here we are making a podcast all about it. So there you go.
Well, while we won't dwell too much on the Euro 2024 finals, because yes, that didn't go well on the field, as much as the Scottish fans were a big hit off the field, which I do feel that's always slightly patronising in some way, a bit like happened to Ireland in some past tournaments as well. Aren't they lovely and bring so much to the tournament before they all bugger off? But anyway, that's a whole other matter. The qualification for that had been superb. You mentioned wins over Spain, Lewis. Well, here we are. Scott McTominay scoring in a 2-0 victory in March 2023 at Hampden. And Scotland coming through the group in fine style, second to Spain, but obviously there's nothing wrong with that. Unbeaten at home, only one loss through the whole campaign, which is away in Spain. And there they were off to another tournament. And it's becoming regular now, Stephen, isn't it? Scotland at the Euros is probably what we now, again, start to expect to see. But I think we want to spend a bit of time on the likes of McTominay, I think, because we have, as Lewis said, he initially had to be persuaded, he had a choice, didn't he? Let's face it. Scott McTominay had a choice of who he could play for, and he opted for Scotland, whether that's for feeling he had a better opportunity at that stage of his career or whether that's where his heart genuinely lies. I've no doubt that all of those factors come into it. But we have a talent here who has emerged from, I don't know, a player who at Manchester United, you wouldn't have thought he was going to go on and become what he has become. He was good, but he wasn't that good, I don't think, unless I'm just missing things and I'm no scout. But he's gone on to become absolutely superb and fundamental. I mean, the things he's done in Napoli is astonishing.
Yeah,
and obviously now that then leads on to what he's doing with Scotland and has done for a few years now.
I mean, Lewis mentioned Gareth Bale before, and the similarities in the two, in that they were, I don't know, considered as younger players and upcoming players, and then being, kind of like young, experienced players. I don't think anyone really kind of plotted the graph, should we say, of what they were going to do. I remember Gareth Bale as being kind of like a bit of a misfit when he first went to Tottenham. He was a left back, and then suddenly he was kind of like an attacker and all of it. And then suddenly he's a Real Madrid player, and he's one of the best players in the world. And it was a weird transformation, and there's so many similarities in Scott McTominay as well. What he's gone and done with Napoli, truly incredible. To be part of a Napoli Serie A winning side. That I think at some point, it looked to me like. That was a football club that was never going to win Serie A again. Just the whole landscape and how football was, and you just felt that Napoli were always going to be that team finishing third or fourth and a good 10, 15 points back behind the champions. Win a Coppa Italia here or there, and maybe get to the knockout stage of the Champions League, and then suddenly there they are as a multiple Serie A winning team in contemporary terms. And then he's been so emblematic, certainly of this latest one that they had 12 months ago. And he's been able to kind of like transfer that to what he's doing in the Scotland shirt. And there's just such a buzz around him, such an aura. And you do kind of like sit up and think, actually, I want to see what's going on here. And that's a tough thing to sell to a Generation Xer in terms of contemporary football. Like say, I've said it on the podcast, and I've got to a point where I'll put a game on the television, but it'll be background music, wallpaper. I'll carry on doing what I'm doing, then I'll look up when I hear kind of like a roar or the commentator gets kind of a bit animated or whatever, rather than watching games. But when it comes to kind of like some teams and some players, then I am invested more. And Scott McTominay is very much one of those, being a kind of, I don't know, a relationship with Serie A that's kind of like ebbed and flowed somewhat. But I've been massively into my Serie A for the last 5 or 6 years again, since Juventus kind of like that monopoly of Juventus titles ended. It's become interesting again, and he is playing a huge part in that. And it's great to see him blossoming. And in that way, it's also great to see Man United kind of like slip up and let this kind of like golden nugget go.
Oh, absolutely. We take those wins where we can. Lewis, Andy Robertson, I guess, is the other stalwart of the era. I mean, we'll come on to the 2026, and I guess he's coming towards the end of his top-level career, but another one, I guess, who has defined this improvement era, who's sort of, well, probably the only other world-class player in the current setup, even, as I say, he's coming towards the end of his peak, shall we say, but he's definitely been fundamental to this rise.
He definitely has. It was one of those issues for Scotland for quite a while before John McGinn was really prominent in the team, and you had this sort of era on McTominay before he became our main man going forward. He was almost similar to Man United. It's like what Stephen was saying, where you almost didn't quite see what he would blossom into. We initially sort of used him as a centre-back in a back three. So he was kind of like an outside centre-back who obviously did a good job there. He did struggle at times, and you didn't really see where that was going to go. So you had this sort of interesting era with Scotland, and it was one of those, so much so that our two best players just at that time happened to be left backs. Obviously, Kieran Tierney was probably the other one. Injuries aside, it's such a shame the way his career's gone, because he really could have. He's had a good career at Celtic. There's some good moments at Arsenal as well. I know they like him down there, but it's one of those one of the what ifs as a Scotland fan. But Andy Robertson has been such a mainstay in what we do, and you can see how important he is, both to Clarke on the pitch, in terms of he is his voice on the pitch, and how much the players sort of rally around him, and just having someone who's consistently playing at such an elite level. Because when we were in these European qualifiers and things like that, as much as we had some brilliant players, as I say, John McGinn, Ryan Christie, Kieran Tierney, they weren't consistently playing at an elite level, whereas Andy Robertson was playing for one of the greatest teams that England will ever see. That Klopp side was absolutely unbelievable. It was obviously him and Trent. I'm not going to talk about Trent too much longer with Stephen here, but it's one of those that he was such a core mainstay in that. And while he was a world-class player, you could very much always tell he never thought he was better than anyone else just because he was playing for Liverpool, just because he was Scotland captain. He worked harder than everyone else did. He left everything on the pitch, and he did make mistakes at times. He hasn't been, I would say there was a few moments, in particular a couple of the games against Israel, where he did look a bit shaky, but always kept his head up, always a brilliant captain. I don't think you can ask for a better captain of the team. And if I was to do my top 5 Scotland players of all time, contentious or not, I think for the modern era and what he's done in the revival, I think you have to have Andy Robertson in it. He's definitely one of my favourite players of all time, just for what he's done as Scotland captain through this period and this sort of revival. I think he's been absolutely incredible and such an important part, such an important piece, and that foundation that you need at the back to let your players such as your McTominay and McGinn flourish further up the pitch. So yeah, we really couldn't have done it without Andy Robertson, I don't think.
Well, with Robertson, McTominay and McGinn and others, Scotland went into the 2026 qualifiers in a group with Denmark, Greece and Belarus. So tough, but not impossible, I think, it was clearly the order here, Denmark being the toughest. But this time Scotland got off to a great start, not the perfect, but a great start, drawing 0-0 away in Denmark. So this set up what proven to be an excellent campaign, that Scotland would only lose once in qualifying, and that was in Greece towards the end. And that was a point where it seemed, it was on the brink of stuttering and Scotland would have still ended up in the playoffs, I think, had it gone wrong on the final day. But that did set up an incredible final qualifier, Lewis. And I think we've got to come to you again on this one, because for you, this must have been an astonishing night where it had gone wrong in Greece. You'd gone 3-0 down and fought back and nearly got that back to 3-3. But at 3-0 down away in Greece, it suddenly felt like the whole prospect of qualifying was slipping away again. And yet, here we come to the home qualifier. I should point out Denmark themselves screwed up on the same night as that Greece game by only drawing 2-2 at home to Belarus. They had to come from 2-1 down to do so, and they couldn't grab a late winner. That then opened the door for Scotland to seal automatic qualification in the final game. They just had to beat Denmark at home. And goodness me, what an incredible game, Lewis, this was.
It was crazy. It was one of the craziest games of football I've ever watched. And it was so quintessentially Scottish in some ways, but the composure we showed in other ways wasn't very Scottish at all. So it's quite an interesting one because I'm not going to harp back again to it for too long, but I think the best football we've sort of played under Steve Clarke was the start of that Euro 2024 qualifying campaign, the beating Spain at Hampden, that last minute sort of Dykes and McLean away in Norway. That was just incredible. I think as much as the results were good at the start of this 2026 qualifying campaign, we were not playing very well, which I suppose is the sign of a good team. Getting that result away in Copenhagen proved crucial, and beat Belarus, beat Greece up until the game away in Greece, which did feel like, is this slipping away again up until the Denmark game, which is, as I say, one of the most incredible games I've ever watched in my life, to be quite honest with you. Obviously, McTominay, after 3 minutes, scores the best goal I've ever seen at Hampden, and that's including Zidane against Leverkusen. I'm going to put it out there. I'm going to be biased. It's one of those in which you think, we are going to do it, and we're going to do it with that. And then, obviously, Scotland do what Scotland do, give away a penalty, 1-1, and it's at that moment we do need to win. That's the crucial thing. We need to win this game, and you kind of think, oh, is that it? Is that it? You've obviously got the red that follows, and then Shanklin pokes in from the corner, and you're thinking, we're doing it again. We're all going crazy. Obviously, everyone running about. It was my heart rate's probably never been that high watching a game of football before, maybe apart from Inverness in the Cup final in 2015. And then Patrick Dorgu scores I think it's 2 or 3 minutes later, and you think, we have really done a Scotland here. This is really quite special, because while you've got the playoffs, you think we were in such a good position here to just go and qualify. And then my personal favourite goal of the night, just because of when it came, what had happened, and I've kind of mentioned his injury issues. I'm by no means a Celtic fan at all or anything, but Kieran Tierney, that beautiful finish on towards the end of the game to make it 3-2. It's just, what a moment for him, someone who's put so much to a Scotland shirt, a brilliant player. It's an amazing goal, and I've never felt an emotion like that watching Scotland. I thought the 2021 was great when we went on penalties, but that was something else, the Kieran Tierney one. I honestly just about had tears in my eyes. And then you're panicking watching this next 5 minutes of football thinking, well, we did concede an equaliser a few moments after scoring before. We are Scotland. How are we throwing this away? And then Kenny McLean, of all people, decides to shoot and score from behind the halfway line. And it's just, what a moment. I will never forget that as long as I live. And the reason it felt Scottish is obviously the highs and lows of it and all the nonsense that went in between. But showing that real resilience in those moments is something we wouldn't have done in those previous those qualifying campaigns that we've talked about. And that's something that I think Steve Clarke's put into the side. And it's just such an immense compliment to the fact that he is, we get very up and down as Scottish fans because, well, look at what we do in all these tournaments and all these qualifiers. But he is that level-headed figure who will instill that into the team. And it is different. We do look like we're going to come back in games now. As I say, I mentioned the Norway one as well. It was 2 goals in the 88th minute onwards in a crucial qualifying game for the last Euros. And obviously this one against Denmark. We do things when they matter late on. I think even in this qualifying earlier on, when Greece were at Hampden, it's 3-1 in the end. It is fairly comfortable, but we do need to score twice fairly late on. We actually go a goal down in 63rd minute or something. And we actually need to score. Well, we instantly reply, really, but we do need a win. We scored 2 quite late on. So it's that kind of never die attitude that we didn't have for so many years that we now have under Clarke, which is just really reassuring. And why you go into these tournaments, even though they haven't gone that well so far, thinking that we might just do something here. And for better or for worse, I do just think we might do something this time at the World Cup.
Oh, right. Well, we'll get into that then, shall we? Scotland have a World Cup then. They have Haiti in the opener. Well, there's banana skin written all over it if ever I saw it. Morocco again and Brazil again in the group. So there's a few interesting fixtures there. But Stephen, this is a World Cup, and I know Scotland have been in them before, where third place teams get through. If ever there was a chance, surely now, that this is Scotland being able to get through a group, getting off to a positive start against Haiti in the opening game is obviously key. Let's be honest. With Morocco semi-finalists last time, and I'm not pretending they'll be on that level necessarily again, but they have a lot of pedigree and experience about them.
They do.
They have players at some of the top clubs in Europe, as do Scotland. But Morocco are a strong team, and Brazil are Brazil. So it's a tough but not insurmountable group.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, like you say, that first game against Haiti is massively key. Win that, feel at home in the competition. And then I think the fact that Morocco will probably, in many respects, be deemed the favourites for that game against Scotland, because of them being semi-finalists 4 years ago, because of the experience that they've got, everything that's surrounded them in recent times. That can play in Scotland's hands. Whereas in 1998, everyone's kind of like, Scotland will get something out of this game against Morocco. There'll be a lot of people who expect them not to. So, I think certainly in those first two games, there is a degree of free hit about it. And yeah, it's going back to the format, certainly the group stages that Scotland experienced in 1986 and 1990 and lost out by a hair's breadth, basically. Yeah, that's where Scotland really should be again in the summer, basically. Whether it's going through to the knockout stages or not going out to the knockout stages, it will surely come down to a hair's breadth rather than it just being a case of it's been too much too soon or whatever it is. I also think the two European Championships that Scotland have now played in the last two tournaments will stand them in good stead as well. There are a lot of reasons to feel like that Scotland can go somewhere they've never been before. I'd just like to go back to that Denmark game as well and just say how fantastic that was. I watched it, and it was just one of the best things I've ever seen. It was magnificent.
Absolutely, it was magnificent. It was knife-edge stuff. It was so dramatic. But Lewis, it has taken you to the World Cup. It has taken you to Haiti, Morocco, and Brazil. Let's get it on record how you think this is going to go.
Well, it's one of those that I'm well aware that I'm looking at it through a prism of bias. It's just on the feelings that I've got for this World Cup are just quite bizarre. It's one of those, I'm kind of similar to Steven in terms of certainly the Premier League and other leagues like that, watching them with not super focused on the game, and it's just you're falling out of kind of love with the sort of dystopian state of the state of club football at the moment in terms of at the elite level. Whereas watching Scotland this past few weeks and months and qualifying for the World Cup has made me feel how I felt watching football like a kid, which is really nice. And that game just epitomised it as literally what it's all about. And as Stephen said earlier, the McTominay factor is just one of those, that player you can pin your hopes on, gets you excited like a Bale and some other players, which is all to say that I'm stalling on what I'm going to decide.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not hearing any prediction here. This is a lot of predictions.
But I will put it on record. Let me decide it now. Okay. So obviously there is the potential banana skin, the Haiti opener, which I must say I'm pretty disappointed. I'm going to have to be getting up at 2:00 in the morning to watch, but I absolutely will be, because who would it be? But I think it does have potential to be a banana skin. I don't think it will be, hopefully, famous last words, but I think we will win by 3, perhaps. I don't think we're going to destroy them. We do still have an issue of goal scoring moving forward. I think we've got, as I mentioned, the likes of Shea Adams, Lyndon Dykes, the players that work very hard. They're not necessarily prolific goal scorers, but Lawrence Shankland is. He probably won't start. So it's one of those, I think goals are going to have to come from midfield. Might take a little bit longer. So I think we'll win by, let's say, 3-0 for that one. Then you've got the Morocco game, which I think is where the group kind of comes down to, in all honesty. And I do not believe this will be an easy game. Obviously, you've got the semi-finalists at the last tournament. I'm sure in the sort of build up to it, they'll pretend they're AFCON winners. That's a story for another day, which we're not going to get into just now. It's a podcast on its own. But I think that if we approach that in a way, it almost suits us a game like that because they are the favourites. They have to go on the front foot, and we are an annoying team to play against. It's the way that Clarke says this. We are pretty pragmatic, and I think it will finish 1-1, which is what I'm saying. I think it'll be 1-1, and we've got 4 points in the group. And I do think we'll be quite valiant against Brazil. I think we'll shut up shop against them a lot more than Morocco will, because obviously Morocco will fancy themselves for that game. But I think Brazil will beat us. I'm not completely blindsided by the optimism of Scott McTominay, as amazing as I think he and some of the other players in that team are. I think we'll lose probably 3-1 to Brazil. But I think those results will be enough I think that's enough to put you through as the third best placed team, maybe second, depending on what Morocco get up to. But I've had a similar story to this before, as I say, with the Euros, and then Hungary go score in the 100th minute of the game. So it's one of those that I'm sure I will be thinking very differently. But I do think we have potential to go through. It's definitely not an expectation. I think best case scenario, you're hoping for second. Third is realistic, but it is a difficult group. I mean, this is a very difficult Morocco prospect to the one that slipped us up in 1998 as well.
Wow. Okay. Well, having waffled initially, you've then gone extremely specific, Lewis. So excellent. We have it all on record. Very, very good. Well, we shall soon see how it goes. And Scotland's, their next World Cup match is against Haiti. Their last one was way back on the 23rd of June, 1998. Against Morocco 28 years ago. And before we wrap things up, let's have our little stoppage time feature, Stephen, the charts of the time when Scotland last played in the World Cup in 1998. I sent these to you both, so we'll have a little look through, but oh dear me, for Lewis, the top of the charts is very England-based, isn't it? We got 3 Lions, 98, an abomination.
We're scrapping those ones straight away, just for the record. When you sent that through, I was like, those are scrapped.
Vindaloo, I felt Les is there. You do have to scroll down a little bit to find Delamitri and Don't Come Home Too Soon. But of course, Scotland were already on their way home. Stephen, what do you pick out from this?
The slim pickings here. I'm really, really struggling. I don't know. I'm going to have to go for. I'm actually going to go under the 40. I'll go Embrace. Come back to what you know, and even then, it's not a particularly magnificent song, but I like Embrace and know quite a few of the songs and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm going to have to go for that because that is a truly shocking.
Didn't Embrace do a World Cup song at one point as well?
I think
2006, maybe.
Yeah, possibly did. It's totally dropped out of my head what it was, but yeah, that is grim. That does make grim reading. I mean,
at least that song was ahead of The Great Escape by the England Supporters Band, which was down at 46, and it is in fact below Delamitri Lewis. So there you go. That's something.
Positives, if nothing else.
I mean, this chart for you is obviously something from your. Way before your time that you won't have much recollection. Anything that stood the test of time in this little lot for you?
Not particularly. I must say I do work in radio, so and we play a fair amount from the 90s. Pretty much not a single thing on this list. So I did also think it was slim picking. So I went for a different kind of angle in terms of, and a bit of a basic one really for the whole France 98 thing. Really, just I'm lucky enough to actually occasionally do some work at Hampden and play some of the music sometimes for certain teams coming out, and Carnival de Paris is pretty much a mainstay in my playlist for that. So sitting there at number 8, I thought that's the one I want to include. It's a bit of a full circle one for me. I'm lucky enough to get to play it at Hampden sometimes, and it's a song of that last tournament that we previously qualified for. So that's the one I've picked. But I do agree. Otherwise, we are talking very slim pickings there.
Well, we shall soon see what the latest iteration of Scotland go on to achieve. If hopefully they won't hark back to some of these in the charts. Maybe they will go deep, like is at number 13 from Janet Jackson, and then they'll soon be dancing the night away like the Mavericks at number 14. Hopefully it's that. rather than Lost in Space at number 6.
Or perhaps I think the most appropriate one for Scotland, you can pretty much encapsulate them in a title here, is number 33, Silver Sun. Too much, too little, too late. That's very Scotland, isn't it?
Perfect. And that is the way to round this off. We have journeyed all the way through this 28 years of no Scottish participation in the World Cup. It'll soon be time, Lewis. It will soon be time for it all to end and a new chapter to be written. Thank you very much, both of you, for your sterling efforts taking us through this lean spell in Scottish World Cup history. Cheers, fellas. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Do give us a rate, a follow, subscribe, all of that stuff, wherever you get your podcasts. Recommend us to all your pals, and join us again next time on Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating. Thank you very much, and bye.